Hello. So, starting our Reconstruction unit, first, I want to make sure that we understand that how important this Reconstruction unit is for our testing next year. We know that the Civil War will be on there, and I know that Reconstruction. We have to answer two questions out of 24, and right here's two of them that we'll be able to answer: the Civil War question and the Reconstruction question. One of the things about Reconstruction that's fascinating to me is how little Americans understand about Reconstruction. And I have to admit, probably as a young student and even through early teaching part of it, Reconstruction wasn't something that we really focused a whole lot on. And I understand why now as I get older. It's ugly. It's not pretty. It's a failure in a lot of ways. And that's what I've written this thesis statement for you. And we're going to take this thesis statement and we're going to create test questions from this um, for you to anticipate what a question could be. So you'll see that I've titled this, if this was my essay or my paper, Reconstruction, a Failed Revolution. And that word revolution means something. So you might want to consider that when you write your questions through this. But here's my statement. During Reconstruction, the federal government missed a unique opportunity to radically restructure Southern society along more egalitarian lines. While conditions for African Americans began to improve during Reconstruction, many of their gains were quickly erased during the Jim Crow period that followed. Now, there's a lot of other things that we could include in there, but this is a basic one to start off. So understanding that the thesis statement sets up what my arguments and my debates are going to be, I want you to create two different questions based upon this thesis statement that could be potential IB exam types of questions. So think in terms of to what extent, how successful, compare and contrast, something along that way to be able to ask these questions. So I'm going to hold off, and that's just going to kind of be there in the background the whole time that you can see it. I just want to go through questions 1 through 6 quickly and kind of introduce this setup of before we get into the presidential plans, which will be Wednesday and Thursday, is to set up kind of what's happening here. And to set the scene or to set the stage after the end of the war. So Lee is going to surrender at Appomattox, and we're almost on that anniversary coming up when he does. But the fighting actually continues. Appomattox is only the surrender of Lee's army. There'll be a little bit more fighting, and the official last fighting is going to actually happen in North Carolina with General Sherman's troops. But the South, for all purposes, is prostrate. It is laid flat on its back. It has come to absolute submission. Total war has been a success. The Union troops led under Grant and Sherman and Sheridan have destroyed the South in almost every possible way, psychologically, physically, economically. And they're left with pretty much nothing and at the hands of what the North is going to do to them. And so they have to try to find a way to move on. And the Union begins to look at how can we reconstruct this former Union that we had and bring these back. Now we're going to get into these arguments between presidential Reconstruction and congressional Reconstruction. But the first question says, from the introduction, contrast the perspectives of Reconstruction of those people who lived through it. And this is really that traditional historiography that comes out of it. And so for white Southerners, it was seen as absolutely vindictive and vicious and destructive, that it inflicted humiliation upon them, and that it delayed bringing about genuine reunion. That because of what the radical Republicans are going to do and enforce what they called Negro rule upon them and making them second-class citizens, that this is going to actually delay this process. Northerners argued, and especially the radical Republicans that lived through this, that these were necessary, that the South was unrepentant, that the Confederates were just simply going to come back into power and to put back into the old system that they had, and that without federal intervention, there would be nothing to stop them from doing this. And there's a lot of truth to this. We're going to see once the federal government leaves in 1877, that's exactly what's going to happen. And so the radical Republicans are going to be justified. How have African Americans and others viewed this period? I'll start with the others, and it was neither vicious an attack nor was it reform. It was a small step to secure these civil rights and the economic powers. It's a baby step. It lays the groundwork, if you will. It lays the tracks for what's to come, but it did not provide African Americans with enough legal protection or material resources. The promise of 40 acres and a mule isn't going to come about. And as a result, when economic crisis hits, as they always do in a market economy, and especially in 1873, when there was another great recession, if you will, Northerners began to turn their backs upon African Americans suffering. They've got their own problems, if you will, out of sight, out of mind. We've talked about that. And so they kind of wash their hands and say, we've done everything that we can do, and we're just going to have to move on from this. Number 3 asks, summarize the disarray of Southern society for both blacks and whites. The reality is, as I mentioned in the beginning of this, is that the South is devastated. They've lost over 258,000 men. So this is going to be almost half of their male population between the ages of 18 and 45 is going to be dead. So they began to kind of romanticize this lost cause and going back to this antebellum. Their whole system, if you could think of something that you've held true, that all of your worldviews and all of your ideology has been based around this one perception or this one ideology, and then all of a sudden for this to be completely gone, even though this ideology is immoral and evil, how do you go about picking up the pieces from this? And so they faced an uncertain future. There was an incredible amount of fear. The joblessness, the crops have been destroyed, the men who were going to, and then the resources of slaves have been taken away, which was the number one commodity in the United States. It created more wealth than any other capital in the United States. And so this becomes a struggle for them to decide to define what freedom means. What did freedom mean or represent for most white Southerners then, and how did they attempt to achieve their goals? Well, in essence, it really meant the ability to control their own destinies. That this is where we get into this idea of big government and small government, that they would be able to create their own institutions without the North or without government interference and try to restore this antebellum periods, that the continuation of slavery in some new form. The big idea is to keep blacks legally tied to the land in some way or the other, because without them, this production and the wealth that had been created is simply going to disappear. And that's essentially what we're going to see, that as a result of the loss of slave labor, many of them will stay and continue to work as sharecroppers. And over time, though, especially when we get to the Great Migration of the 1920s, we're going to see that they're all but going to have left. So what did freedom mean to the new freedmen or African Americans, and how did they differ on how to achieve these goals? Well, the first thing is that they all agreed upon it was an end to slavery and the injustices and the humiliation that they had suffered for hundreds of years. But it also meant gaining rights and protecting these rights themselves. So where did they differ on this was how to achieve this. And this is still an argument that we have today. There are still those, if you take an African American studies class, and if we take a look at how African American leaders have differed on how do we achieve these. For some, they said the best way to achieve this was through government intervention, through the government redistributing land, the 40 acres and a mule, if you will, reparations, and that if you create this economic opportunity for us, then we'll be able to survive, and not only survive, but be able to thrive. Well, there's another thought that goes behind this for some, and they simply say, just give us legal equality in every way, shape, or form, and then get out of our way. That we can do this. And this is where there's a debate still today with this idea of affirmative action and how affirmative action can be a positive or how affirmative action can be a negative. We'll get into a little bit more of that when we get into the civil rights part of it and we take a look at Du Bois and some of these others. But for now, we'll kind of leave it there. In the end, the 40 acres and a mule is not going to come. They are going to get these legal rights, if you will, between the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. But as this thesis claims, that it's going to be a failure in the end, that although some gains were made, they'll be quickly erased. And we'll see how the South then circumnavigates around these amendments themselves. And then the final one for today is the Freedmen's Bureau itself. So important to understand that the Freedmen's Bureau is part of the military. It's created under the president. It's during the war still. It's in 1865, in March of 1865, just a few weeks before Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated. But it's an agency of the U.S. Army, and it's directed by General Howard. And the idea behind the Freedmen's Bureau is that they're going to distribute food to former slaves. They're going to establish schools. They're going to make efforts to settle blacks on lands, which they will. And many of these lands that the slaveholders, especially in the large plantations, these lands will be divided up all along the coastlines in Louisiana, where African Americans are going to be given this land with the thought that this is theirs to keep. Little small plots of land that's kind of 40 acres. But as we're going to see under Johnson's administration and then later, that they're going to be kicked off of these lands. These lands are going to be given back to the former owners, and some sort of labor contracts will be worked out, which again is going to lead into sharecropping in that sense. They had the authority, though, to operate only for 1 year. And so in the end, it was way, way, way too big of a job for such a small organization. They only had 900 men to enforce this. Although there'll be some great successes, and later the Freedmen's Bureau will be extended beyond that year. But it's an effort, but in the end, it's really not enough. So that's where I'll leave off with our conversation today. There's going to be the other video that's going to be put up on David Blight that you're going to have some questions to answer on it. You're going to write the thesis statement, easy for me to say, based upon this video. And then we'll come back on Wednesday and Thursday, and we'll go over the Reconstruction plans themselves. So Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, Johnson's Reconstruction plan, and then finally the Radical Republicans. And then we'll have a little bit of compare and contrast from those two. So that gets us through. So we have these A days and B days, of course. I don't know which day it is. So you have until Wednesday, if you will, to get these thesis statements questions written, or the questions for the test, and to go from that. So if you have any questions, of course, you can always contact me. Hope you have a great day.